Hi guys, and welcome to Calm Night Radio channel. Tonight we step onto a raw American shoreline where almost nothing feels settled, and almost nobody is safe. The air is wet, salty, and heavy with wood smoke. Mud clings to boots, voices carry through thin timber walls, and the whole colony seems one bad winter away from disappearing. You may have heard broad stories about the first Africans in English America told in a few neat lines, as if everyone already knows what happened next. But the truth is stranger, less tidy, and far more human. What does it feel like to arrive in a place that barely understands itself, where your future is uncertain, your status is unclear, and your name can be bent by another person's pen? So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, and you find yourself looking toward the coast of Virginia in the middle of the 1620s, where the English colony is still young enough to feel improvised. Nothing here seems polished. Nothing feels permanent. The settlement is not the grand New World dream promised in hopeful language across the Atlantic. It is a rough place of timber, smoke, sweat, and anxious planning. You smell wet earth first, then stale beer, river water, damp straw, and the sharp sweetness of curing tobacco. You are a black person in this uncertain world, and that fact shapes every hour, even when the rules around your life are not yet written with the iron certainty they will later carry. The colony has Africans in it by this time, though the number is still small. Their presence is recorded in fragments, sometimes in clumsy spellings, sometimes in lists so dry they almost erase the people they name. Yet behind each record stands an actual life, breathing in the brackish air, feeling the same chill dawn, hearing the same crows and axes and muttered prayers. Morning begins early here, very early, before the sun lifts cleanly over the water. The sky is pale and damp and the settlement stirs. You hear a rooster somewhere, then the scrape of a stool, then a cough that sounds deep enough to shake a whole chest loose. A cooking fire wakes up with a crackle. Someone curses softly because the wood is green again. Someone else laughs through a nose blocked by cold air and smoke. Nothing about the place sounds rested. You feel the colony through touch as much as sight. Splintered wood beneath your hand, coarse cloth against your neck, the slick edge of mud as you step around puddles that never seem to dry. Even indoors, dampness reaches you. Walls sweat. Bedding holds the smell of bodies and river chill. Shoes, if you have them, rarely stay clean. Hands roughen quickly. Skin dries in some places and stays clammy in others. This is a land of stubborn discomfort. Jamestown and the settlements around it are not elegant outposts of civilization. They are fragile footholds. English colonists still struggle with disease, hunger, poor planning, and endless disappointment. Many had arrived expecting quick gain and light work, which is almost funny now, in the darkest possible way. The place demands labour from everyone it can hold. Food must be found, planted, traded for, or guarded. Buildings must be repaired. Fences must stand. Boats must move. Tobacco must be raised because tobacco is what turns this risky experiment into money. That crop changes the feel of everything. It is everywhere, in conversation and ambition, in the smell drifting from curing sheds, in the way men talk about land as if more land might solve every problem. Tobacco promises profit, so profit demands workers, and workers become the colony's constant obsession. You can sense it in the eyes that assess bodies here. Strong back, useful hands, age, health, skill, endurance. In a struggling plantation world, people are watched with a practical, unsettling attention. Yet in 1625, the lines that define black life in English America are not fully settled in law and custom the way later centuries will know them. This does not mean life is fair. It does not mean the colony is gentle. It means uncertainty hangs over everything. Historians still argue over how to describe the exact position of Africans in these earliest English years. Because the records are thin, the colony is changing fast, and human lives resist tidy categories. Some Africans appear in household and labour lists beside servants. Some seem to have occupied statuses that were harsh, constrained, and deeply vulnerable without matching every later legal definition of racial slavery. The truth does not sit neatly for anyone hoping for simple boxes. That uncertainty would not feel academic if you were living it. It would feel personal, immediate. You would want to know whether your labour ends in years or never, whether baptism changes anything, whether a child born here inherits a mother's burden or finds a path around it, whether service can become land, wages, livestock, or freedom, whether an English promise means anything after harvest, whether survival today earns safety tomorrow. No one around you can answer with confidence. That is part of the terror. The colony itself runs on rumour almost as much as food. You hear stories in pieces, carried between work and dusk. A ship delayed, a governor displeased, a bad crop in one place, a better yield in another, a man who drank himself into foolishness, a woman who stitched through fever and lived, an Indian town nearby that trades 1 month and vanishes the next. The air feels full of partial knowledge. People speak as if certainty were a luxury item imported from somewhere else. You would notice, too, that the English are never as calm or unified as later national myths pretend. Gentlemen look down on labour, then panic when labour is short. Preachers talk about providence, then complain about supplies. Soldiers posture, planters calculate, servants grumble. Everyone seems to suspect someone else of laziness, theft, pride, or bad judgment. Even the supposedly powerful often appear hungry, sweaty, and worried. It is hard to feel awe before people who are arguing over corn and leaking roofs. There is a strange comfort in seeing that fragility, though only a slight one. The English want order, but they do not yet possess much of it. Their records are inconsistent, their habits are odd, their confidence can look theatrical. They ring bells, hold prayers, issue commands, and write inventories as if writing a thing gives them full control over it. But the river rises when it wants. Sickness comes when it wants. Hunger arrives without asking permission from any official. You live close to danger here. Disease remains one of the colony's constant rulers. Fever can flatten a person quickly. Dysentery is common. Malnutrition weakens bodies already strained by work and climate. Medical treatment is limited and often miserable. You smell vinegar, herbs, sweat, and sickness in close quarters. You hear the restless turning of someone who cannot sleep because their stomach twists or their chest burns. Death is not a rare interruption. It is part of the atmosphere. A mainstream fact of early Virginia is that life expectancy for many newcomers was shockingly low. The colony had survived its earliest disasters, but survival did not mean health, ease, or stability. For black people arriving or living there in the 1620s, this harsh environment combined with social vulnerability in especially cruel ways. A difficult colony becomes more difficult when power over your movement, labour, or future may lie in other hands. And still, even here, daily life is not made only of suffering. Human beings insist on being human in every era, which is inconvenient for systems that would prefer them reduced to property, labour, or numbers. You hear songs sometimes, soft at first, then steadier. You catch laughter. You notice a habit of carrying oneself with care, even in worn clothing. Someone remembers a way of braiding hair. Someone cooks something with an old instinct that survives the ocean crossing in fragments of taste and method. Someone repeats a name carefully, refusing to let it vanish just because another person cannot pronounce it properly. One quirky detail from this early period is how much of the colony's daily drinking involved beer or weak ale, because clean water could not always be trusted. So while Virginia imagines itself as a bold new society, many of its people move through the day slightly underwatered, slightly ill, and faintly beery. It is not the polished civilization of schoolbook paintings. It is a muddy settlement trying not to collapse while half the population smells like smoke and fermented grain. You would also notice how much the natural world presses in around the English presence. Forest edges loom, insects whine, birds call from reeds and branches. The river keeps moving with a calm indifference that can feel almost rude. At night, darkness comes thickly. Once fires burn lower, the settlement shrinks into pockets of light. Beyond them lies sound rather than sight. Frogs, water, wind in brush, a branch crack that might mean nothing, or not nothing. Your ears work harder after sunset. The stars can be brilliant when clouds clear. They do not soften the place. They widen it, under them. The colony seems small and temporary, a handful of anxious buildings pressing against a continent the English barely understand. For a black person in this setting, arrival is not just arrival in America. It is arrival into an unfinished experiment shaped by commerce, coercion, religion, fear, and improvisation. You are not entering a settled nation. You're entering a question. Who belongs here? Who commands? Who serves? Who can leave? Who can own? Who can testify? Who can marry? Who can inherit? Those answers are not yet fully hardened, which means they can shift, narrow, and harden under your feet while you're standing on them. That is one of the coldest truths in this early moment. Unclear status is not safety. It is exposure. There are faces around you from different worlds, though the English records flatten them. Men and women from African regions with distinct languages and histories, English settlers from different counties and classes, sailors who have seen more coastlines than fields, labourers whose dreams have narrowed into food and sleep, officials pretending greater control than they possess, native peoples nearby, watching these newcomers with their own calculations, judgments, and memories. Virginia is already a meeting ground, though not a peaceful one. In quiet moments, you may hold on to small private acts, repeating words inwardly, marking time by weather and moon, studying who holds power and who only performs it, learning the habits of this place without surrendering the self entirely to it. That inward life matters. The records almost never show it. Of course. They tell you who was counted, bought, assigned, listed, or baptized. They rarely tell you what it felt like to stand in wet grass at dawn and decide to endure one more day, yet that feeling is where history truly lives, not only in governor's letters or shipping notes, but in breath, posture, hunger, memory, and attention. In the first years for Black Americans in English America, so much remains unstable that every ordinary act becomes charged with meaning. To wake is to continue. To watch is to learn. To keep your name, or part of it, is its own small rebellion. To survive in a place this raw is no simple thing. So the shoreline of 1625 is not just a beginning on a calendar. It is a world of damp wood, uncertain law, thin records, and relentless labour taking shape around living people. You stand in that world with the smell of river mud in the air and wood smoke in your clothes. The colony is still making itself. It has not yet decided all the forms of cruelty it will perfect, but the first outlines are there, faint and gathering. While you listen to the morning rise over Virginia and feel the ground, soft and unstable, beneath your feet, by the time the sun lifts fully over Virginia, the day already feels used. Heat gathers early in the fields, and the soft ground gives off the rich smell of wet soil, trampled grass, and rotting leaves. You step into labour almost at once. Nobody here seems to drift gently into the morning. The colony pushes, hands move, tools scrape, voices call out across rows and fences. A dog barks near a shed, somewhere close by. A hammer strikes wood in a steady rhythm that starts to feel like a second heartbeat. This is the world of work that surrounds black life in 1625, Not the polished image of grand plantations that later centuries would know so well, but something rougher and more improvised. Fields are expanding, houses are crude, storehouses lean slightly as if they are tired already. Everything depends on labour, and labour never really ends. Tobacco sits at the centre of it all, greedy and demanding, as if the plant itself has a personality, and that personality is deeply unpleasant. You can smell tobacco long before you understand all the ways it shapes the colony. Fresh leaves have a green, thick scent. Curing leaves release something sweeter and sharper, mixed with smoke and damp wood. Men speak of tobacco constantly, with the anxious devotion of people who have pinned their future to one crop and are trying not to panic about it. A good harvest means profit. Profit means more land, more ships, more supplies, and of course, more workers. That last part never disappears from their calculations. In practical terms, the work is exhausting. Land must be cleared first, which means hacking at roots, brush, and stubborn tree stumps. The forest does not give way politely. It resists. Branches snag at sleeves. Mosquitoes circle your face and neck. Sweat runs down your back and gathers at the waistband of rough clothing. The air hums with insects. Dirt grits between your fingers. Even the shade can feel hot. Then comes the planting and tending. Tobacco requires attention at each stage. It is not enough to drop seed into soil and stroll away with a heroic sense of accomplishment. Beds must be prepared carefully. Young plants need watching. Weeds spread fast. Worms and pests destroy leaves. Timing matters. Weather matters. The entire season can tilt because of too much rain, too little rain, careless handling, or simple bad luck. You begin to understand that this colony has chosen a crop that behaves like a spoiled prince. The labour force in early Virginia is mixed in status and origin, though not in power. English indentured servants work under fixed terms, at least on paper, and many live hard, punishing lives. Some arrived poor and desperate. Some were tricked by hope. Some knew exactly what misery awaited and came anyway because life in England had narrowed into debt, hunger, and very few doors. Their complaints are constant, though not always unjustified. They grumble while hoeing, mutter while carrying bundles, and dream aloud about the day their service ends. For black workers, the situation is even more uncertain. The colony does not yet operate under a fully mature legal code of racial slavery, but uncertainty does not soften daily life. It often makes it more precarious. Terms of service can be unclear. Treatment depends on masters, local custom, personal relationships, and the shifting needs of the colony. A person may hope for eventual freedom and still live under severe discipline. Another may find that promises bend when labour becomes more valuable. The field does not care about those distinctions. The body does, and the body keeps score. By midday, shoulders ache from lifting and bending, caking, cutting and carrying. Palms harden. Fingers sting where blisters rise or split. Necks burn under sun. Legs grow heavy in muddy ground. Clothes cling. Thirst becomes a presence of its own, sitting at the back of the throat. Food is plain and often limited. Cornmeal, peas, salted meat when available. Perhaps fish, perhaps broth. Perhaps not enough of any of it. Hunger does not always arrive as drama. Sometimes it is just a constant thinning feeling. Housing offers little relief. Many dwellings are small, smoky, and crowded. Timber walls let in drafts, roofs leak. The smell inside is a mixture of damp straw, ash, old broth, wet leather, and sleeping bodies. Privacy is nearly impossible. Rest is shallow. Someone snores. Someone coughs. Someone scratches at flea bites in the dark. The bed itself may be a pallet, a bench, or something barely worth the name. The colony asks for immense physical output and returns very little comfort. A common historical fact about Virginia in this period is that tobacco agriculture transformed the colony from a struggling outpost into a labour-hungry economy. That transformation did not happen neatly. It happened through punishing field work, land hunger, and a rising obsession with extracting value from human effort. Black people in the colony were drawn directly into that system at an early stage, when methods were still forming but the appetite for labour was already fierce. There is also the matter of supervision. Work is watched, not every moment, not with modern efficiency, but with enough pressure to shape behaviour. Overseers in the later plantation sense are not yet fully established everywhere, yet masters, foremen, and other labourers all become part of a landscape of observation. You can feel eyes on pace, posture, and output. Too slow, too quiet, too independent, too tired. Any of these may invite comment. Labour is never only physical. It is social theatre under unequal power. Still, people find room for personality. That is one of history's little miracles. Even in a field, humour appears, a muttered remark, a side glance, a joke dry enough to survive the weather. Gentle sarcasm works especially well in hard conditions. It asks very little energy and delivers decent emotional returns. Someone says the tobacco receives better care than most Christians. Someone else remarks that the weeds are thriving more honestly than the planters. Even under strain, wit survives. At times, labour is shared in ways that create brief moments of human closeness. Hands pass tools. A warning is given about a hidden root or slippery patch. Water is offered. A tune is hummed. Seeds are handled with practiced care. Not friendship exactly, not always, but recognition. The colony thrives on dividing people by rank, origin, and usefulness. Yet ordinary work sometimes creates thin threads of understanding that authority cannot entirely control. A quirky tidbit from early colonial life is that tobacco was so central to Virginia's economy that it sometimes functioned almost like money. Debts, wages, fines, and exchanges could be reckoned in pounds of tobacco. Imagine a world where your crop is also your wallet, your boss's obsession, and the reason your back hurts. It is efficient only if you enjoy confusion and leaf dust. In the afternoon, the heat often turns the landscape sleepy and harsh at the same time. The light flattens everything. Air hangs still. Buzzing insects seem louder than they should be. Sweat dries into salt on skin. You become aware of touch in tiny details. A rough sleeve brushing the wrist. The handle of a hoe worn smooth by many hands. A straw hat, if there is one, pressing against the forehead. Mud drying at the ankle. Sometimes the whole day feels made of textures. Then weather changes without much ceremony. Clouds build. Wind shifts. Rain can strike quickly and hard, darkening the soil and filling the air with the smell of crushed leaves and fresh earth. Work may pause or continue depending on urgency and command. Nothing about life here is arranged for comfort. If a fence must be repaired, it is repaired. If leaves must be handled, they are handled. The colony is always one spoiled crop, one broken storehouse, or one failed shipment away from trouble. Historians still disagree on many details of labour organisation in these early years, especially when it comes to the exact experiences of Africans whose lives appear only briefly in colonial records. Some evidence suggests varied treatment and status from place to place. Other evidence points to coercion and exploitation severe enough to show the system hardening early. What remains undeniable is the central fact of bodily labour. Whether labelled servant, labourer, or something more ominous in practice. Black people in Virginia were drawn into a world where work consumed daylight and shaped survival. Domestic labour also fills the colony. Not everyone remains in the fields all day. Food must be cooked, clothes washed, water hauled, fires maintained, tools cleaned, children watched, animals tended, grain pounded, stores counted. A household in Virginia is not a quiet private nest. It is a site of constant production, Women in particular, whether English, African, or of mixed household position, often bear layered burdens that the records barely notice. Their work is everywhere and nearly invisible at once. Smell tells its own story. A kitchen corner carries onion, smoke, stale grease, and boiled grain. A yard near livestock brings manure and sour hay. A curing shed smells rich, bitter, and heavy. Along the river you catch salt, fish, mud, and the faint rot of marsh growth. Human life presses against all of it. Sweat in wool, wet linen, ash on hands. It is not a clean world. It is an intensely lived one. When evening approaches, work does not end so much as loosen. Tools are gathered, us bodies slow. The light softens across the settlement. Birds call from trees and reeds. Smoke rises straighter in the cooling air. You may eat then, or hope to. You may sit on a rough bench, a log, the ground, whatever is available. Muscles throb quietly. Conversation drifts. Some people boast about output. Some complain. Some fall into silence because speech requires more energy than they have left. In those quieter moments, skill becomes easier to notice. Not all labour is brute force. Some people know how to mend a tool head, judge weather signs, preserve food, treat a sore limb, shape a basket, build a fire fast, or handle animals without fuss. African knowledge, though too rarely named properly in English records, would have mattered in countless practical ways. A colony obsessed with command often forgets how much it depends on the intelligence of the commanded. You also learn that labour here is tied to aspiration, at least for the English planters. They imagine advancement in acres, leaf quality, and household size. They talk about land the way hungry people talk about stew, always more, never enough. To them, labour is the engine of expansion. To the labourer, it is the structure of the day and the measure of exhaustion. One person sees promise in a field. Another feels only the ache of having made that promise possible. There are no soft focus scenes in this reality. No graceful montage of noble pioneers and cheerful workers building a nation together. That version would be convenient, and convenience is not history's strong point. The truth is heavier. Black life in early Virginia was shaped by effort that was relentless, closely tied to the colony's economic ambitions, and lived under conditions of deep vulnerability. The field, the yard, the cooking place, the storehouse, and the rough sleeping space all belonged to the same demanding world. And yet each day still had its own texture, a cooler breeze after rain, the sweetness of a roasted ear of corn, the comfort of sitting down at last, a scrap of song, the strange beauty of evening light on the river. Labour did not erase the senses. In some ways it sharpened them. When life is this physical, you notice everything. The rasp of basket reeds, the smell of hot timber, the relief of shade, the softness of dusk. So you live inside a colony that measures human beings by usefulness, while depending completely on their endurance. You wake to work. You move through smoke, mud, sweat, and leaf dust. You watch a society built in haste discover that wealth has a body count, even when the counting remains selective and dishonest. And in the worn rhythm of another long day, under heat and command and the endless appetite of tobacco, you come to understand the true engine of early Virginia. It is not dream, it is labour. A name can become a shelter when almost everything else feels exposed. In early Virginia, that shelter is fragile. You live in a colony where clerks write quickly, spell badly, and often record only what matters to them. A person can be reduced to a single line in an inventory, a baptism note, a muster, or a legal remark that says very little and implies far too much. For Black Americans in 1625, one of the strangest parts of life is this battle between remembered identity and recorded identity. You know who you are. The paper does not always care. You hear names spoken in many ways. Some are English, some are African, Some are half changed by another person's mouth. A man may carry a name from his homeland and answer to another in the colony, because that is what the English insist on using. A woman may keep the sound of her own name alive in private, repeating it softly, while public records force a version that sits awkwardly on the page. The change is not small. It touches memory, family, dignity, and belonging all at once. The colony loves lists. That is one of its favourite habits. It lists supplies, livestock, tools, crops, deaths, arrivals, servants, and debts. It writes things down with the confidence of people who assume records equal understanding. But lists are thin. A name on paper cannot hold a full life. It cannot capture the smell of home once known, the rhythm of a mother's speech, the songs tied to work, or the small habits that made a person recognisable to those who loved them. A list is tidy, a human life is not. You might stand in a yard or by a work site and hear language itself become a kind of weather. English voices dominate official space, of course, but they are not the only sounds. African languages and speech patterns survive in fragments, especially among those who can speak with others who share part of their origin. Sometimes that sharing is brief and cautious. Sometimes it is impossible. People brought from Africa did not all come from one culture, one kingdom, or one tongue. They arrived with different histories behind them, and the colony flattened those differences with lazy indifference. That flattening matters. It is easier to control people when you pretend they all came from one vague place called Africa, as though a vast continent were a single village with one set of customs. The English are very good at broad categories when those categories help them feel informed without doing the work of actual understanding. They can identify a barrel of nails with remarkable precision, yet remain cheerfully vague about a whole person's origins. Colonial confidence is a truly resilient species. Still, memory survives in details. You might notice hair arranged in a familiar way, a gesture of greeting, a rhythm tapped with fingers against wood, a preference in cooking, a way of handling grief or prayer. These traces matter because they prove that identity is not erased simply because power wants it simplified. It can be damaged, distorted, interrupted, and buried under labour and fear. Yes, but it does not vanish on command. Early Virginia contains people from Central and West African regions, whose lives before English America would have been shaped by their own communities, political worlds, religious practices, and trade networks. That is a basic historical truth often lost in simplified retellings. The first black people in English America were not blank figures entering history for the first time. They arrived with histories already behind them. Some may have known farming systems, metalwork, animal handling, navigation, trade, warfare, or skilled domestic crafts. Some came from Christian backgrounds influenced by earlier contact with Europeans. Others carried spiritual traditions unfamiliar to the English. No one arrived empty, and yet the colony works hard to make past lives less visible. It does this partly through paperwork, partly through labour routines, and partly through social pressure. English names can be imposed. Baptismal records may reshape identity through religion. Household roles may replace personal histories. A person becomes known as belonging to a particular planter, widow, or household. That phrase alone carries an entire philosophy. Not who your parents were, not where you were raised, not what your childhood smelled like after rain, just who claims you now. Touch becomes part of this experience too. Identity is not only heard and spoken, it is worn. Rough linen instead of cloth once familiar, leather stiff with damp, hair handled by another person's rules, skin marked by labour, climate and new conditions. The body becomes the meeting point between memory and adaptation. You may still carry old reflexes in how you tie, wrap, wash, sit, or move, but the colony presses against them daily. It tells you how to dress, where to stand, when to work, how to answer. Food can hold memory longer than paper does. Taste is stubborn. In a place where meals are often plain and limited, any familiar method of preparing grain, greens, fish, or stew can become a tiny act of preservation. Smell matters as much as flavour. Smoke rising from a pot. The earthy scent of boiled peas. The sharper edge of onions or herbs. A person may catch one note in the air and feel, for a brief second, the shape of another world. These flashes do not remove suffering. They remind you that the self still has roots. There is scholarly uncertainty here too. Historians still debate how much cultural continuity could be maintained in these earliest decades, given the small and scattered black population in English Virginia, the varied African origins of the people present, and the intense pressures of labour and control. Some scholars emphasise rupture and isolation. Others point to adaptation, improvisation, and the survival of meaningful practices in small forms. The records do not settle the argument cleanly because the records were not designed to preserve the inner lives of the vulnerable. That silence is part of the problem. Religion adds another layer. The English imagine Christianity as both belief in social order, baptism, prayer, church attendance, and moral instruction all carry meaning in the colony. For black people, contact with English religion could be coercive, strategic, sincere, confusing, or all four at once. Some Africans arriving in the Atlantic world were already Christian through Portuguese influence in parts of Africa. Others encountered English Protestant practice as something strange and severe. Sermons in Virginia would be long, stern, and deeply convinced of their own importance. Sleep would be a tempting theological response, yet faith itself cannot be reduced to official ritual. People carry beliefs in gestures, in spoken phrases, in how they understand suffering and luck, in what they fear at night, in how they bury the dead or remember them. The colony may control the church building, it cannot fully command what a person means by prayer. In that gap, inner life continues. You also learn that names can shift according to audience. A person may answer one way in public and another among trusted listeners. This is not deception so much as survival. Different worlds demand different forms of self-presentation. Colonial society encourages that split by refusing to honour complexity. Under such conditions, identity becomes something protected through layering. One name on the record, another in the heart, another perhaps known only to a few. A quirky detail from the early 17th century is how wildly inconsistent spelling could be, even for English names recorded by English clerks. A single person might appear in different documents under several spellings, and no one seemed terribly troubled by it. This means that when African names met English pens, the results could become even more distorted. Imagine trying to preserve your identity while being documented by a man who spells William 3 different ways before breakfast. It is not ideal. Sound remains one of the strongest carriers of self. The ear catches what paper misses. The tone of a familiar phrase, the cadence of a remembered prayer, the music of a name spoken correctly. In a world of commands, noise, and hurried instructions, these sounds can feel precious. Evening may offer the best chance to hear them, when labour eases and speech becomes less performative. Voices lower, conversation stretch. Someone repeats a place name from far away. Another person asks quietly whether they know that river, that coast, that people. Recognition may last only a moment, but even a moment matters. The English do not always understand what they are hearing, which can create both danger and space. Misunderstanding is risky under unequal power. It can also allow private meaning to survive inside public confusion. A phrase may sound harmless to a master and carry layered significance to the speaker. A rhythm hummed while working may seem casual and hold memory for the person making it. Oppressed people across history become skilled at hiding meaning in plain sight, because plain sight is often the only place available. Children complicate identity further. A child born or raised in Virginia may grow into a world already different from the one their parents knew. Language shifts, accent shifts, Household expectations shape behaviour. At the same time, family memory can pass through lullabies, warnings, habits, and stories, even if only in fragments. The colony may try to produce useful labourers, but families and communities, however fragile, still shape people beneath official categories. Clothing also tells a quiet story. Imported cloth, coarse work garments, patched items, borrowed pieces, and improvised coverings all reflect status and necessity. But dress can include choice even in narrow conditions. How fabric is tied, how hair is wrapped, what is repaired carefully, what is kept clean despite hardship. Such decisions can carry pride. They say that a person remains a person, not merely a body assigned to work. The atmosphere of early Virginia makes all of this harder. Humidity curls fabric and hair, rain ruins storage, mud stains hems, smoke settles into everything. Nothing stays pristine. Perhaps that is useful to remember. Identity here does not survive in perfect form, sealed away from damage. It survives in altered form, worn and resilient, like an object handled daily and still kept. You sense, too, that the English crave fixed categories because fixed categories make ruling easier. They want clear labels, Christian or heathen, servant or free, English or other. Yet real people resist these neat divisions. An African man may know more of trade than the planter judging him. A woman classified narrowly by others may carry a whole architecture of memory inside her. The colony records the outer shell and mistakes it for the whole structure. This part of life in 1625 is less dramatic than a battle and more intimate than a law code. But it matters enormously. To live in the first years of Black America is to feel identity under pressure from every direction. Name, language, memory, faith, clothing, food, and gesture all become places where survival and selfhood meet. The contest is quiet, often invisible, and constant. So you move through Virginia listening closely to how people call one another, noticing what is spoken carelessly and what is spoken with care. You learn that records can preserve a presence while failing to preserve a person. You understand that memory may travel in the mouth, the hand, the cooking pot, the prayer, and the private repetition of a true name. In a colony eager to classify human beings for its own convenience, that inward act of remembering becomes a form of endurance. And in the humid air of this unsettled world, where ink dries faster than justice, the struggle to remain fully yourself is already one of the deepest stories of all. In 1625, one of the strangest truths in Virginia is that the colony still feels unfinished in its rules. Power exists, of course. It is real, uneven, and often cruel. But it's not yet arranged into the full legal machine that later generations would recognize so easily. For a black person living there, this creates a life shaped by danger and uncertainty rather than by a single clean definition. The English want order, the colony keeps improvising. You see this in the way people talk about labour, service, punishment, and rank. Nothing sounds fully settled. One man speaks as if service should end after a term. Another acts as though control over a labourer ought to last as long as convenience does. A widow managing a household may negotiate differently from a wealthy planter with larger ambitions. Local custom matters. Personal power matters. The distance between official rule and daily reality matters a great deal. The colony is legal in theory and improvised in practice, which is not always a comforting combination. The English bring with them old ideas about hierarchy. They believe deeply in rank. Gentlemen stand above common labourers. Masters command servants. Men expect authority over women in most public matters. Religious leaders claim spiritual guidance. Officials issue orders from a posture of importance that can be almost theatrical. Yet the actual conditions of Virginia undermine neat social arrangements. Sickness cuts down the respectable and the poor alike. Food shortages embarrass pretensions. Rough work stains everyone. Even those with status often live in timber houses that creak in storms and smell of smoke. That instability makes the colony feel less like a finished society and more like an argument being held outdoors, a loud argument, in mud, with mosquitoes. People are constantly testing what can be demanded and what must be negotiated. An indentured servant may resist in small ways. A master may threaten punishment and then soften because labour is scarce. A household might rely heavily on a person it officially ranks beneath, creating an awkward dependence nobody wants to describe too honestly. Life is full of these tensions. For Black Americans in this setting, the uncertainty is especially sharp. The social and legal meanings of African descent in English Virginia are becoming more restrictive, but they are not yet fully fixed in the way later laws would make them. That means some Africans and people of African descent may find limited openings, while others face coercion that looks terrifyingly close to permanent bondage. The range itself is part of the story. There is no comforting clarity in it, only exposure to shifting power. A key historical fact is that early 17th century Virginia had not yet enacted the full body of slave law that would define race-based hereditary slavery later in the century. Those laws hardened over time, especially from the 1640s through the late 1600s. In 1625, however, the colony sits in a more fluid and unstable phase. Fluid does not mean fair, it means that outcomes can depend on circumstance, connections, local practice, and the desires of those who hold authority. That reality would affect how you read every interaction. A promise matters, but only as much as the person making it. A baptism may carry spiritual meaning without guaranteeing social protection. Hard work may improve how a household values you, yet being valued can itself become another form of confinement if usefulness makes release less likely. A marriage or partnership might bring support, though the law may not honour it equally. Every possible opening is narrow, and every narrow opening can close. The atmosphere of this uncertainty seeps into ordinary life. You hear it in conversations near doorways and workyards. Men debate terms of service, inheritance, punishment, and property in practical language that sounds dry until you remember those words can shape an entire life. There is no grand public voice announcing stable principles for everyone. Instead, the colony inches forward through cases, disputes, habits, and self-interest. Rules emerge because someone wants labour secured, land protected, children classified, or disorder controlled. This is where historians still disagree in important ways. Some argue that the early decades of English Virginia allowed more room for manoeuvre among Africans than later periods did, pointing to instances of property ownership, freedom, court appearances, and social mobility among some individuals of African descent. Others caution that such examples were limited and exceptional, and that from the start Africans were treated in ways that marked them as uniquely vulnerable within the labour system. Both views illuminate part of the landscape. The colony contains signs of possibility and signs of hardening at the same time. You can almost feel that debate in the air, though people living then would not phrase it like scholars. They would feel it in much simpler and more urgent terms. Can this person marry? Can that person testify? Will this term end? Does that child belong to the master's household forever? Does religion change status? Who has the right to own land, livestock, or tools? These are not abstract questions. They are the difference between a life with edges and a life with none. The English are not always consistent in their own categories either. They distinguish between servants, apprentices, labourers, tenants, and dependents. But everyday practice blurs these labels. A person under contract may be beaten. A person supposedly protected by custom may be neglected. A master may treat one labourer as temporarily bound and another as effectively permanent. Law, economy, and prejudice mingle until the actual experience of life can feel very far from the official language used to describe it. Touch is part of this social world too. Authority is often physical. A sleeve grabbed to stop movement. A shoulder turned by another hand. A tool assigned. A body directed toward a field. a yard, a doorway, a task. The colony tells you where you stand not only through words but through physical arrangement, who sits, who serves, who waits outside, who eats first, who is expected to remove a hat, bow a head, lower a gaze. These tiny gestures become a grammar of rank. Smell and space reinforce it. Better households, if they can be called better, may have more stored food, drier corners, sturdier chests, and a little more privacy. Poorer dwellings smell more sharply of damp bedding, smoke, old broth, and crowded sleep. Yet even the grander households are still colonial structures, vulnerable to weather and decay. Virginia in 1625 offers rank, but rarely luxury. That may be why status is performed so aggressively. When your walls are thin and your roof leaks, you have to cling to superiority with extra enthusiasm. A quirky detail of early English colonial life is how heavily people relied on formal language and ritual to create the impression of order. Commissions, oaths, inventories, seals, and titles all mattered deeply. Men who could barely keep mildew off their papers still behaved as though paperwork itself were a sort of magic shield against chaos. There is something almost charming about that. Until you remember those papers could help determine who controlled whose labour. Even clothing can signal the improvisation of status. Fine garments wear out fast in Virginia. Lace and wool lose their elegance in smoke and humidity. Shoes sink into mud with equal indifference whether they belong to a gentleman or not. Yet people keep signalling rank through what remains. A slightly better hat, a cleaner cuff, a silver button, a sword carried more for statement than necessity. Social order is stitched together from such details, even while the landscape keeps trying to ruin them. For black people, this unstable structure creates moments that are hard to predict. A household may depend on your skill enough to grant small favours, perhaps better food, more trusted tasks, or a little room for negotiation. Another household may tighten control because dependence breeds fear as easily as gratitude. A person who proves capable can become indispensable. That sounds promising until you remember indispensable labour is precisely what many masters do not wish to lose. Religion provides another uncertain layer. Some English colonists think Christian baptism should matter morally, perhaps even socially. Others quietly resist any interpretation that might weaken their claim over labour. You can sense the tension beneath polite language. Spiritual equality is a lovely idea right up until it threatens someone's tobacco profits. At that moment, theology often develops practical limitations with remarkable speed. The colony's courts and officials also play a role, though not a fully predictable one. Early legal cases involving Africans and their descendants suggest that some could appear in court, own property, or pursue claims under certain conditions. Yet legal presence does not erase social vulnerability. Access to a court is not the same as equal standing within it. A person might win a narrow point and still live under broad insecurity. Law offers tools, but not certainty. Children born in this world inherit confusion along with life. Their place may depend on the status of parents, the claims of masters, local understanding and evolving custom. Families exist, but colonial systems do not always honour them as families in the full human sense. Affection, responsibility, and kinship may be deeply felt while remaining poorly protected. That gap between lived relationship and recognised relationship matters enormously. It is one more way the colony remains unfinished and dangerous. The sound of Virginia at dusk captures some of this unsettled quality. Voices drift from doorways. A kettle lid rattles softly. Someone chops wood for the night. Frogs begin their endless music near marshy ground. A child cries, then quiets. Men speak in low tones about yields, terms, and rumours. Nothing in those sounds announces a finished society. Everything suggests a place still building itself through strain, conflict, and improvisation. And that is the heart of life for Black Americans in this particular moment. You live inside a system that is becoming more racialized, more exploitative, and more determined to control black labour, yet it has not fully written all of its later rules. That gap creates a narrow and unstable landscape where possibility and peril exist side by side. Some people may carve out space, others may find space denied. Many will live in the shadow of decisions made by those above them. Decisions justified afterward as though they had always been obvious. But they were not obvious. They were made. That is an important truth. The brutal order that later generations know did not descend complete from the sky. It developed through choices, habits, court rulings, economic pressures, prejudices, and the steady appetite for labour. In 1625, you're standing in the earlier phase of that process, when the colony still shows its seams. You can see where power is being stitched tighter. You can feel the cloth pulling, so daily life unfolds under a kind of unfinished verdict. Not freedom, not security, not equal personhood in the eyes of the colony, but not yet the fully codified regime that later centuries would enforce with colder precision. You live in the middle of formation, where ambiguity itself can become a weapon, and in the smoky, damp, restless world of early Virginia, that may be one of the most unsettling realities of all. The rules are still being written, and they are being written on human lives. By now, you understand that survival in Virginia is not a background condition, it is the main event. Every day begins with a question of who will remain standing by nightfall, and the answers are rarely comforting. The colony may speak grandly about profit, faith, and settlement, but the body hears a simpler language. Hunger, fever, cold, damp, pain. In 1625, black life in early America is shaped not only by labour and uncertainty, but by a physical world that keeps pressing hard against the limits of endurance. The morning air can feel beautiful for a moment. Mist hangs above the river, light turns the water pale silver, birds call through reeds and trees with absurd confidence, as though nothing in the world is wrong. Then the smell reaches you. Marsh waters, mud, fish, wet timber, old smoke from last night's fire. The colony wakes inside a bowl of moisture and rot, and that dampness settles into everything. Clothes never seem fully dry. Bedding holds the chill. Walls sweat. Shoes soften, then stiffen, then split. Disease loves such places. That is one of Virginia's least charming features. Fever moves through households with terrible ease. Dysentery weakens people until standing becomes work in itself. Respiratory sickness settles into the chest. Skin erupts in sores and bites. Malnutrition leaves bodies thinner, slower, and easier for illness to claim. Medical knowledge exists, but it often feels like a hopeful collection of guesses wearing a serious expression. A person may be bled, purged, dosed with herbs, wrapped, prayed over, and still die by sundown. You hear sickness before you fully see it. A rough cough from the next room. A bucket shifted suddenly in the dark. Low groaning from a pallet. The restless turning of someone too hot and too cold at once. In crowded spaces, illness is never private. It becomes part of the whole household atmosphere. The smell changes too. Sour linen, vinegar, sweat, wet straw. A little smoke trying and failing to cover what cannot really be covered. You learn quickly that the colony carries death in ordinary sounds. A basic historical fact of early Virginia is that mortality remained high well after the settlement survived its earliest disasters. The environment, poor sanitation, inadequate diet, and limited immunity to local diseases all made life precarious for newcomers and long-term residents alike. For black people living under unequal conditions, this danger could be even sharper because access to food, shelter, rest, and care often depended on the priorities of others. Food itself is never guaranteed in the easy, comforting sense. There may be corn, peas, fish, salted meat, or broth, but the quantity and quality vary. Some days the meal tastes mostly of smoke and salt. Some days the stew is thin enough to seem philosophical. Bread can be coarse, meat can be stringy, fish can smell stronger than anyone would prefer. A hungry person eats anyway. Hunger is not dramatic every hour. Often it is dull and constant, like a weight hung inside the body. You begin to understand how much energy it takes just to remain fed in this place. Crops fail, supplies spoil, boats are delayed, rats steal, weather interferes, bad storage ruins precious stores, a barrel leaks, a roof drips, a sack tears, and suddenly the colony is discussing scarcity again with the exhausted surprise of people who refuse to learn from patterns. There is almost a comedy to it, if you are in the mood for grim comedy. Virginia builds badly, stores badly, plans badly, then reacts with wounded confusion when things go badly. Black Americans in this environment cannot simply step outside the system and fend for themselves. Labour obligations, restricted movement, and dependence on households or planters shape daily options. If food is short, you feel the shortage. If sickness spreads, you breathe the same air. If a master chooses economy over care, your body pays the bill, even where treatment is not overtly brutal. Vulnerability remains. Survival depends partly on the colony's competence, which is alarming because competence is not always its strongest quality. Touch becomes unforgettable in such a world. A forehead too hot, a hand colder than it should be, a blanket damp with sweat, mud sucking at the foot after rain, mosquito bites raised along the wrist and neck, the rough edge of a bowl scraped nearly clean, a cramped sleeping place where your shoulder presses against timber or another body. Comfort exists mostly in tiny forms, a dry patch of cloth, warm broth, a breeze through an opening, a place near the fire, but not too near. Then there is winter. Virginia winters are not always the brutal frozen epics some imagine, but they can still cut hard through a body already strained by labour and poor shelter. Cold rain is miserable in ways that deserve their own sad little anthem. Wind slips under doors, wet wood resists burning, fingers stiffen, smoke stings the eyes when everyone crowds closer to heat. The smell indoors turns heavier then, all ash, wool, damp straw, and unwashed clothes. In cold weather, a small fire can feel like the centre of human civilization. Summer is no gentler. Heat hangs over the fields, air grows thick enough to seem chewable. Mosquitoes rise in whining clouds near standing water, flies gather around food, animals waste, and any open sore they can find. Sweat soaks shirts, runs into the eyes, dries into salt, then returns again. The body never fully rests from the assault of weather. Each season presents its own argument for why this colony should perhaps have remained someone else's ambition. Native knowledge of local foodways, landscapes, and seasonal adaptation was far greater than English colonists often admitted. That is another essential truth. The colony survived in part through trade, borrowing, coercion, and observation involving native peoples, even while English accounts like to celebrate English resilience. Black people entering this world stepped into a place where survival knowledge was unevenly distributed and often politically charged. Who knew how to find food, preserve it, plant effectively, or move safely through the land could matter as much as any official order. Historians still debate the exact causes and patterns of illness in some parts of early Virginia, because records were inconsistent, diagnoses were vague, and contemporaries misunderstood much of what sickened them. Malaria, dysentery, typhoid, salt poisoning, influenza, and other conditions may all have played roles at different times and places. The names used then do not always match modern medical categories. What no one disputes is the sheer scale of physical weakness and death. People got sick often. Many died young. Fear, therefore, is not abstract. It sits close to the skin. A cough lasts too long and everyone notices. A person misses work and rumours start. A child grows quiet. Someone stops eating. Someone's eyes turn dull. People who have seen enough of the colony know how quickly these signs can darken. There may be prayer, there may be effort, there may be an herbal remedy prepared carefully by someone who has learned through experience, and there may still be loss. A quirky detail of the early 17th century is that some remedies used in England and the colonies mix practical plant knowledge with ideas that feel wonderfully alarming now. Treatments could include strange syrups, heated applications, purges, and ingredients whose main medical effect seems to have been making the patient lose the will to complain. The line between care and ordeal could become rather thin, yet people did care for one another. That matters. Illness is not only a record of suffering, it is also a record of attendance. Someone fetches water, someone wrings out cloth, someone helps a sick body sit up, someone coaxes a few spoonfuls of broth past dry lips, in black life especially. Where written records so rarely preserve tenderness, these acts must have existed far more often than the paper admits. Human beings in danger do not survive by law alone. They survive by each other. The senses sharpen around danger. You notice the smell of spoiled grain more quickly. You hear a change in the weather before the clouds arrive. You watch river levels. You learn which corner stays driest in a storm. You recognize the first sign of rot in stored food. You learn how long meat can hang, how smoke changes preservation, how to conserve fuel, how to ration without announcing desperation too loudly. Survival becomes a craft made of attention. Animals contribute their own layer to the atmosphere. Chickens scratch and complain. Pigs root with rude determination. Dogs bark at strangers and shadows alike. Livestock produce manure, noise, flies, and occasional food, all in varying degrees of usefulness. Near animal pens, the smell can be astonishing, not subtle, not mysterious, very direct. Yet those creatures are part of the fragile safety net. A healthy pig can mean future meat. A lost pig can mean sharp words and real anxiety. Storms are especially frightening. Rain drums hard on roofs. Wind rattles shutters and pushes smoke back down into a room. Water finds every weakness in the structure. It seeps under thresholds, through thatch, along wall seams. Fire must be protected. Stores must be moved if possible. Bodies huddle close while thunder rolls over the settlement. In those moments, the colony feels exactly what it is. A vulnerable cluster of wooden hopes in a landscape large enough to ignore them completely. For Black Americans, all these pressures meet the deeper insecurity of status. If you fall ill, who decides whether you rest? If you weaken, who still expects labour? If food runs low, who eats first? If shelter is cramped, who receives the driest corner? Power enters survival through these practical choices. Oppression is not only found in dramatic declarations, it lives in the allocation of warmth, food, treatment, and time. And still, life continues in stubborn little ways. Someone laughs weakly after fever breaks. Someone manages to swallow hot corn mush and keep it down. Someone opens a door after rain and breathes cooler air with real relief. A child sleeps at last. The fire catches properly. Morning arrives and one more person rises than you feared would. These are small victories, but early Virginia is built from small victories held against large threats. So the first years of Black America are not simply a story of arrival and labour. They're a story of bodily endurance in a place where land, climate, sickness, and poor planning constantly test who can survive another season. You move through wet heat, cold rain, smoky rooms, thin meals, and nights disturbed by coughing or storm wind. Fear never fully leaves the settlement. It lingers in the smell of sick rooms and empty bowls, in the silence after a name is not answered. And in that harsh, uncertain colony, survival itself becomes one of the heaviest forms of work a person can do. One of the more surprising parts of life in Virginia is discovering how closely you must watch the English just to understand the world around you. They are the people claiming authority, writing records, giving orders, and speaking most loudly about civilization. Yet when you observe them up close, they often seem far less solid than they pretend. Their houses leak, their tempers flare, their prayers go on a very long time, their stomachs complain, their grand confidence can vanish the moment food runs short or a shipment fails to arrive. You see them in the early light, before they have arranged their faces for public importance. A man steps outside rubbing his eyes, hair flattened strangely on one side, shirt half fastened, trying to look like a master of destiny while also trying not to sneeze into the yard. Another bends over a basin, splashing cold water on his face and muttering about the weather, as though the weather has singled him out personally. An older woman already tends the fire with the grim competence of someone who knows that if she doesn't do it, nobody else will do it properly. The English call themselves ordered people, and sometimes they are. They keep records, they mark ranks, they ring bells, they gather for worship, they discuss duties, obedience, and proper conduct with great seriousness. But their order is constantly threatened by the realities of colonial life. Mud enters every plan. So does hunger, so does jealousy. A gentleman may speak elegantly about divine purpose, then spend the afternoon quarrelling over tobacco quality or accusing a neighbour of stealing a pig. Human grandeur has its limits. You notice class differences very quickly. The English are not one seamless group united in calm purpose. They carry old divisions from home into the colony. Gentlemen tend to guard their status fiercely. Even when the environment refuses to cooperate, they prefer command to manual labour, though many colonial situations make such preferences hard to maintain with dignity. Poorer settlers and servants often look at them with a mixture of resentment, dependence, and weary amusement. The high talk of honour sounds a bit different when everyone smells of smoke and damp socks. That tension matters because it shapes the world you must navigate. A wealthy planter may command more land and labour, but he may also be deeply in debt, physically weak, or desperate for a good crop. A middling settler may appear less powerful, yet still holds serious authority inside a household. A servant may have little status, but may know exactly where food is stored, who is feuding with whom, and which promises are empty. The colony runs on layers of unequal knowledge. A basic historical truth of early English America is that colonial society reflected England's sharp class hierarchy. Virginia did not erase those distinctions. It often intensified them. Land ownership, household authority, and access to office gave some colonists real power. But poverty, service, and dependence remained central features of everyday life. Black Americans entering the society encountered not only racial difference, but a deeply stratified English social order already obsessed with rank. Religion is one of the clearest windows into English life. You hear prayers before meals, sermons on holy days, and constant references to sin, providence, and moral duty. Ministers and laypeople alike speak as though God is personally monitoring each crop failure, argument, storm, and rash decision. Perhaps he is. If so, he has a front row seat to a remarkable amount of bickering. English Protestant culture in Virginia values discipline, scripture, and public expressions of piety. Though the daily behaviour of colonists does not always match the tone of their prayers, church-going, when possible, is both spiritual and social. People gather, listen, observe one another, and reinforce the structure of the colony. Clothing is noted, behaviour is judged, attendance matters. The place smells of wood, wool, breath, and the faint dust of use. Voices rise in prayer, though not always in harmony. Some listen intently, some fidget, some seem moved, some look as if they are calculating crop yields behind solemn eyes. Faith is sincere for many, but sincerity and self-interest live side by side with impressive comfort. The English household offers another revealing scene. Domestic life is busy, noisy, and often tense. Fires need tending, food must be prepared, tools are mended, children are corrected, Clothes are washed, patched, and dried as best they can be. The division between public and private is thinner than later households might expect. Labour spills through every room and yard. Authority is expressed constantly in small commands. Bring this, carry that. Stir the pot. Watch the child. Shut the door. Fetch water. The colony talks in instructions. You begin to see that English ideas about family are also tied to hierarchy. The household is not just a place of affection. It is a unit of order, labour, and discipline. The master rules. The wife manages within limits that can be wide in practice and narrow in principle. Children obey. Servants serve. Dependents know their place, at least in theory. Reality is messier. Of course. Wives can be formidable. Children can be slippery little creatures. Servants can resist in half a dozen quiet ways before breakfast. Still, the ideal remains powerful. Food tells you much about English habits too. Their tastes travel with them, though Virginia forces adjustments. They value bread, ale, meat, pottage, butter, and familiar methods of cooking. Yet the colony offers new ingredients, uncertain supplies, and many opportunities for disappointment. Meals can be plain, repetitive, and heavily influenced by what survives storage. The smell of boiling grain and salted meat becomes ordinary. So does complaint. The English are very loyal to complaint. It may be their truest national tradition. A quirky detail of 17th century English life is how much people associated good order with proper table habits, clothing, and posture, even under rough frontier conditions. A man could be living in a draughty wooden house beside a muddy yard, but still feel strongly that someone had held a spoon incorrectly. Civilization, apparently, is fragile enough to collapse over soup manners. Their speech patterns also reveal a great deal. English voices in Virginia carry county accents, class signals, and borrowed phrases from law, scripture, and trade. Some people speak roughly and directly. Others decorate simple points with grand language, especially when they wish to sound important. You hear legal terms dropped into ordinary conversation, moral warnings offered over dinner, and biblical phrases used to dignify very practical concerns. Nothing makes a planter feel more majestic than comparing a tobacco problem to a spiritual trial. For Black Americans, watching this speech closely is a survival skill. Tone matters. A polite request may actually be a command. A compliment may conceal an expectation. A sermon may signal a household policy. An argument between Englishmen may create danger or opportunity for everyone under their authority. Listening is essential. You learn who drinks too much, who overpromises, who frightens easily, who likes praise, who remembers slights, who treats labourers with harsher discipline, and who needs certain people more than pride allows him to admit. The English relationship to violence is also revealing. They value law and order, yet punishment is accepted as a normal part of authority. Whippings, public correction, and physical discipline appear within households, labour arrangements, and legal systems. Violence does not always arrive dramatically. It can be ordinary, procedural, and chillingly calm. A person is corrected. A body is made into an example. The lesson is meant for everyone watching. That acceptance of coercion shapes the atmosphere of the colony in ways no sermon can soften. At the same time, the English are vulnerable in ways they do not like to display. They fear native resistance. They fear starvation. They fear disease. They fear social disorder among servants and labourers. They fear divine punishment. They fear one another's ambition. Their confidence is real, but so is their anxiety. You can hear it after dark when voices lower. Men speculate about attacks, crop failure, political disputes, or shortages. They are building power while constantly afraid of losing control. Smell often gives away their condition before words do. Anxious households smell sharper. Sweat, stale ale, singed porridge, Wet wool too long near the fire. Better supplied households may smell of wax, stored grain, and stronger broth. But even there, fear has its own atmosphere. Rooms go quieter, movements sharpen, doors close faster. You do not need a written proclamation to know when the English feel uncertain. Their bodies announce it. Historians still debate how much English colonists in these early decades understood the long consequences of the social order they were creating. Some likely saw themselves as improvising practical solutions to labour and survival. Others surely understood that they were building a harsher and more unequal society, even if they avoided saying so plainly. The line between habit and design is not always easy to draw. What is certain is that the English worldview in Virginia mixed entitlement, insecurity, hierarchy, and relentless economic ambition. There are moments, of course, when individual English people show kindness, humour, fatigue, generosity, or grief in ways that complicate any single picture. A woman shares food. A man softens toward a sick child. Someone laughs at a small joke while mending a tool. Someone cries after a death. The English are not made of one material. They are contradictory, like everyone else. But their contradictions operate within a structure that gives them power over others, and that power matters more than their moods. You also observe how much the English depend on appearance. Titles, manners, property, and moral language all help them present authority as natural. But much of that authority rests on performance. It must be repeated daily. Orders must be spoken again. Boundaries must be enforced again. Status must be displayed again. In a place this unstable, power cannot relax for long. That may be why it often looks so tense. By evening, after labour and heat and argument, the English sometimes seem almost ordinary in a way that would be funny if the stakes were not so serious. They eat, complain, scratch insect bites, mend torn clothes, and stare into the fire as if they have personally discovered exhaustion. Children droop with sleep. Someone snores in a chair. Someone else keeps talking long after everyone wishes he would stop. The colony's rulers are, in many moments, just tired people in smoky rooms trying to hold together a difficult world, and that is part of what life teaches you. The English are powerful, yes. They are also divided, anxious, self-important, improvised, and intensely human. Their society is not a smooth wall. It is a structure made of habits, fears, claims, and daily performances. To live among them is to study that structure constantly. You learn the sound of their prayers, the limits of their order, the weight of their class pride, and the nervous energy beneath their control. In the first years of Black America, such knowledge is not merely interesting, it is necessary. Virginia is not occupied by only two kinds of people. That becomes clear the longer you live there. The colony often tells its story as though the world contains English settlers at the centre and everyone else pushed to the edges, but the land itself refuses that tidy arrangement. Black people, English colonists, and native communities all move through the same broad landscape, watching one another with caution, curiosity, calculation, and sometimes fear. Life in 1625 unfolds in a place of constant contact. Though not equal contact, and certainly not peaceful simplicity, you feel that contact first in movement. Canoes on the water, English boats at the landing, footpaths through woods and marshy ground, smoke rising from different kinds of settlements. The river carries more than fish and mud. It carries news, goods, rumours, and danger. A shoreline can be quiet at dawn and tense by midday if strangers appear. Everyone is paying attention to who is coming and why. For Black Americans in early Virginia, native peoples are part of the reality of the place from the beginning. The English are not building their colony in an empty land. They are intruding into a region shaped by powerful indigenous societies with their own political relationships, trade systems, and territorial understandings. That fact matters enormously. It changes what the colony is, what it fears, and how survival works. The English may talk as though they are planting civilization. Native communities know perfectly well that something more disruptive is happening. You notice quickly that the English attitude toward native people swings wildly between dependence and hostility. They trade when they need food or local knowledge. They posture when they want control. They negotiate one week and suspect betrayal the next. The whole relationship seems charged with insecurity. The English want native corn, native pathways, native information, and native cooperation, but they do not want native power to remain intact. Those are not compatible wishes, though the colonists rarely let that stop them from trying. A central historical fact of Virginia in this period is that the English colony existed within the wider world of the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom and neighbouring indigenous communities. Relations included trade, diplomacy, conflict, and periodic violence. The Great Assault of 1622 was still a recent wound in English memory by 1625, and its effect shaped colonial fear, military policy, and settlement patterns. That atmosphere of suspicion would have touched everyone living in English-controlled spaces, including black people. You can hear that fear in casual talk. Men mention attacks in lowered voices around evening fires. Women glance toward tree lines when children wander too far. Weapons are checked with a seriousness that needs no explanation. Fences and palisades are discussed not as abstract improvements, but as barriers between life and death. The English speak of safety often because they do not feel safe. They are still recovering from the knowledge that the land around them is not under their command, no matter what their paperwork claims. For black people, this creates a complicated social position. You live under English authority, but the English are not the only people whose actions can affect your survival. Native communities may appear as trading partners, wary observers, possible allies in imagination, or figures filtered through English fear and hostility. Direct contact would vary greatly. Some black individuals may have encountered native people only in brief exchanges or glimpses from labour sites. Others may have had more sustained contact through work, travel, trade, or local circumstance. The records leave much uncertain, but the shared landscape itself makes interaction unavoidable. The natural world reinforces this sense of overlapping presence. Forest sounds carry differently when you know that other communities move through those woods with far more confidence than most English settlers ever will. You hear the crack of a branch and wonder who passed there. You notice a trail that English boots did not make. You see signs of fishing, planting, or fire use that remind you the land already has habits. The colony pretends to mastery, but the earth keeps revealing older knowledge. Native agriculture, mobility, and environmental skill would have been deeply visible to anyone paying attention. Fields planted differently from English fields. Canoes handled with ease. Food gathered from places the English might overlook. Seasonal rhythms understood through long familiarity. Black Americans entering Virginia stepped into that reality too. Even if English accounts tried to reduce native peoples to enemies or obstacles, practical life would show otherwise. Knowledge lived all around the colony, and much of it was not English. At the same time, the colony's power structure pressures black people to see native communities through English eyes. English fear becomes ambient. Stories of attacks circulate constantly. Warnings are repeated. Distinctions between different native groups may vanish in colonial speech, replaced by broad labels and anxious generalizations. That flattening resembles how the English talk about Africa. It is a familiar habit. When they do not understand complexity, they often replace it with confidence. Confidence, in fairness, requires much less effort, yet human beings notice more than power wants them to notice. You might see a trade exchange and register the restraint in it, the careful reading of posture and intention on both sides. You might hear different tones used for diplomacy than for command. You might observe that native clothing, movement, and use of the land carry a practical grace the English often lack. You might also see native people studying the English settlement with a look that says, quite reasonably, these people appear both dangerous and oddly underprepared. A quirky detail from early Virginia is how often trade involved not grand diplomatic spectacle, but ordinary useful things: corn, fish, copper, cloth, tools, skins, information. The fate of an ambitious colony could turn on who had food and who needed it badly enough to bargain. Grand Empire has a surprisingly humble smell when it's standing in a yard hoping someone will exchange maize for metal. Touch and distance both matter in this world of contact. A meet-in across a clearing feels different from a transaction at arm's length. A shared object, passed from one hand to another, can carry trust, necessity, or threat. A canoe pulled onto shore beside an English boat says more than any speech about whose waters these really are. You begin to understand that power is felt physically in space: who approaches, who retreats, who waits for whom, who keeps a weapon visible. Historians still disagree about the extent and character of direct black and native interaction in the earliest decades of English Virginia, because surviving records are thin and filtered through colonial priorities. Some scholars emphasize scattered contact shaped by English oversight. Others point to the wider Atlantic and American pattern in which Africans, Europeans, and indigenous peoples encountered one another in many layered ways, including alliance, conflict, trade, and family formation. The uncertainty is real, but so is the basic truth that these communities inhabited an entangled world. That entanglement could also produce shared recognition, not equality, not romantic harmony, but recognition. A black person living under English domination might perceive something in native resistance that feels legible at a human level, even if circumstances prevent any meaningful alliance. A native observer might see that not every dark-skinned person standing in an English field holds the same status as the Englishman giving orders. Such perceptions may never enter the record. They still matter. The English work hard to prevent unstable solidarities. That is another thing you learn by watching them. They prefer categories that keep people separate and readable: English, Indian, Negro, servant, master, ally, enemy. These labels simplify a world they do not control. They also protect colonial power by discouraging more complicated relationships from becoming visible. A person who can only be classified one way is easier to manage than a person whose loyalties, memories, and possibilities cross boundaries. But boundaries are rarely complete in practice. Children stare at strangers with open curiosity. Labourers exchange glances during trade. Interpreters, guides, and travellers move between worlds. Goods pass from one community to another and change meaning as they move. A tool made in one world clears land in another. A food grown by one people sustains another people's household. A rumour born in one language arrives transformed in the next. The colony is a place of collisions, and collisions always leave traces. You feel the atmosphere most strongly at dusk. That is when the settlement seems to shrink inward, and the wider land seems to expand around it. English fires glow. Night insects begin their steady song. The smell of smoke thickens. Beyond the immediate light lies darkness shaped by water, trees, marsh, and pathways the English do not fully know. Somewhere out there are native communities living according to rhythms older than the colony. Their presence is not theoretical. It presses on the imagination of every settler household. For black Americans, that surrounding world may hold both danger and possibility in the abstract. The reality would be far more difficult than any simple dream of escape or contact. The land is unfamiliar. Colonial surveillance exists. Native communities have their own interests and political calculations. Yet the mere fact that the English are not alone changes the psychological map of Virginia. Their authority is serious, but it is not the only authority in the land. Their fear proves that. The colony's violence ensures that cross-cultural contact never feels innocent. The memory of raids, reprisals, kidnappings, and broken agreements hangs over everything. Trade may occur in the shadow of attack. Diplomacy may unfold amid preparation for war. Individuals may behave pragmatically while broader systems remain hostile. This layered tension defines the region. Nobody moves through it untouched, and so you live in a world where every shoreline, path, and patch of forest belongs to more than one story at once. Black life in 1625 is shaped not only by English households and tobacco fields, but by the larger contest over land, survival, and power in native Virginia. You watch the English fear what they cannot command. You sense the presence of peoples the colony cannot erase. You learn that this place is not a simple frontier but a crowded human landscape, alive with separate histories pressed against one another. In that uneasy meeting ground, every glance across water or woods carries more meaning than the English would ever comfortably admit. In a colony built on command, even the smallest choice can feel enormous. Life in Virginia does not suddenly become gentle in 1625, and it certainly does not become just. But within the rough machinery of labour, dependence, and unequal power, tiny spaces sometimes open. A person notices them almost by instinct. A trusted task, a private bargain, a chance to learn a skill, a moment when one household needs something badly enough to treat you as more than a pair of hands. These openings are narrow, unstable, and often unfairly distributed, yet they are part of what life actually feels like. You begin to see that not all labour carries the same weight. Fieldwork is visible, exhausting, and central. But the colony also depends on specialised tasks that make certain people more valuable in complicated ways. A person who can handle livestock well, repair tools, tend a kitchen fire properly, preserve food, row confidently, mend clothing, or manage household routines may become harder to replace. Skill does not erase vulnerability. It can, however, create moments of negotiation. A master who needs competence may speak differently than a master who thinks anybody will do. That difference matters. A planter may still command, a household may still impose service, yet usefulness can alter tone, opportunity, and daily treatment. You might be assigned indoor work instead of the hardest field labour on some days. You might be trusted with supplies. You might carry messages, handle keys, prepare food, care for animals, or assist with tasks requiring steadier judgment. None of this guarantees protection. Still, in a world where so much is forced, relative position shapes the texture of life. A basic historical fact of early Virginia is that some Africans and people of African descent in the 17th century obtained freedom, held property, worked in skilled roles, or appeared in court, though such cases were limited and did not reflect equal treatment. The early colony had not yet locked every black life into the exact legal framework that later hardened so brutally. That incomplete structure created occasional openings, however narrow, for bargaining, movement, and advancement under certain conditions. Those conditions could be painfully specific: the right household, the right local custom, the right shortage of labour, the right skill noticed by the right person. Sometimes chance plays a rude and oversized role in history. One man is valued for his knowledge of crops. One woman becomes essential in domestic management. Another person gains favour because illness in a household makes dependable care precious. Such openings are not gifts from a fair system. They are cracks in an unfair one. You would feel those cracks most in ordinary exchanges. The sound of a voice softening because it needs cooperation. The offer of a better portion of food after a difficult task. The permission to tend a small garden patch. A little more latitude in movement around the property. The chance to keep poultry, tools, or goods. A conversation held in practical rather than purely commanding tones. These things are modest, but modest things can matter greatly when almost nothing is secure. The colony runs on relationships as much as rules. That is one of its strangest features. Formal authority matters, but personal ties often shape real outcomes. A widow may rely heavily on a capable worker, and therefore grant favours she would never describe as rights. A master may trust one labourer more than another and assign responsibilities accordingly. A neighbour may know someone who can vouch for character, skill, or faithful service. None of this makes the system humane. It makes it variable, which can be both useful and dangerous. Danger remains close because every opening can be withdrawn. A trusted task can become a burden. A favour can create jealousy. A promise can evaporate after a death, a marriage, a debt, or a change in ownership. The colony is deeply unstable in this way. A person can build a fragile degree of standing and lose it because a crop fails or a household changes hands. Security never sits comfortably. It perches. Still, people seek room where they can find it. Some may save small amounts of produce or tobacco. Some may raise a few animals if allowed. Some may form partnerships, formal or informal, that improve chances of survival. A couple of hens, a patch of corn, a well-mended shirt, a useful knife, a little credit in a local exchange. These are not grand signs of liberty, but they can enlarge a life. Material smallness and emotional importance often travel together. The senses reveal these quieter forms of striving. You smell greens cooking from a tiny garden harvest and know that somebody made skill out of poor soil and limited permission. You hear the contented cluck of chickens kept close to a yard and understand that they represent more than eggs. You feel the smooth handle of a tool cared for carefully, because replacing it would be difficult. You notice a chest or bundle where a person stores what little is truly theirs. Possession becomes intimate in a world where ownership is contested. A quirky detail of early Virginia is that many colonists relied on informal credit, favours, and exchanges because coin was scarce and practical life demanded constant improvisation. Tobacco, labour, livestock, and household goods all moved through these small local economies. In such a world, skill and trust could function almost like currency. It is not exactly a cheerful banking system, unless your ideal bank smells of leaf dust and chickens. Marriage and family can also create limited forms of stability, though never guaranteed ones. Relationships offer companionship, shared labour, and practical support. A household built by two people can distribute burdens differently than one person alone. Children, too, can deepen attachment and purpose, even while increasing anxiety in a colony that does not protect black family life reliably. Kinship matters because it gives life shape beyond work. It also matters because the colony's power becomes clearest when it threatens or ignores those bonds. Some individuals of African descent in the 17th century later became known to history through landholding, wills, court actions, or business dealings. Those examples should not be exaggerated into a comforting picture, but they do show that the earliest decades contained a more uneven field than the later slave regime. You are living in a moment when some doors, though mostly half shut, have not yet been nailed closed. A person paying attention would feel that possibility and its risk at the same time. Learning is another form of opening. You study how the English keep records. You learn who counts livestock, who measures tobacco, who settles minor disputes, who knows the tides, who speaks to ships, who trades with neighbours, who stores grain correctly, who wastes everything. Knowledge accumulates quietly. A person with knowledge can sometimes turn it into leverage, or at least into better judgment, under domination. Understanding the system is never nothing. Historians still disagree about how common genuine upward movement was for black people in the earliest English colonies, partly because surviving evidence highlights unusual individuals while leaving ordinary lives obscure. Some scholars warn against overstating mobility from a handful of cases. Others emphasize that early legal and social ambiguity did allow certain people to claim property, family standing, or contractual rights that later law would attack more systematically. Both cautions matter. Opportunity existed, but it was narrow, uncertain, and never detached from danger. Trust, when it appears, is rarely pure. That is worth remembering. A master may trust because he wants profit. A neighbour may assist because she expects reciprocity. A church connection may bring inclusion while reinforcing hierarchy. Even affection can exist inside an unequal structure without dissolving the inequality. Colonial life is full of such uncomfortable mixtures. People may rely on one another deeply while remaining far from equal. Human feeling does not always behave as neatly as justice would prefer, yet ordinary acts of competence can still bring dignity. Preparing a meal well in poor conditions, calming an animal no one else can manage, repairing a broken item with patience, keeping children clean despite mud, smoke, and shortages, making a dry sleeping corner from a wet room, growing something edible from stubborn ground. These are not small in lived experience, as they are the daily architecture of endurance. A person may not control the law, but may still shape the quality of a day. You sense this most in evening spaces. After work, after orders, after heat and noise, there can be a different tempo. A pot simmers. Someone trims a wick or stirs embers. Low conversation carries through smoky air. A child dozes against an older shoulder. Hands keep moving, shelling peas, mending cloth, twisting fibre, cleaning tools. In those hours, practical skill becomes almost beautiful. It is quiet, useful, and stubbornly human. There is also the possibility of reputation. In a small colony, people become known for steadiness, known for skill, known for honesty, or for silence, or for surviving hard seasons without complaint. Reputation can travel farther than rights. It is fragile, yes, but it can affect how others treat you and what opportunities appear. In a world with limited formal protection, character as perceived by others can become a kind of shield, though never a perfect one. Sometimes the opening is simply a chance to imagine more. Not fantasy in the foolish sense, but practical imagination. Could a term end? Could goods be saved? Could land be leased, used, or someday held? Could children be raised with some measure of stability? Could a connection with a church, a court, or a neighbour be turned toward advantage? Oppressive systems fear such imagination because it keeps the future from belonging entirely to the powerful. And so life in 1625 includes more than command and suffering alone. It includes the narrow art of making room where room is not generously given. Black Americans in early Virginia watch for tiny chances and sometimes manage to use them. Through skill, trust, family, reputation, and careful bargaining, a person may secure a little more food, a little more dignity, a little more control over daily life. These are not signs of a kind society. They are signs of human resilience working inside an unkind one. In a world determined to measure people by their labour, those small openings become one of the quietest and most important ways a life can remain its own. By 1625, you can already sense a harder future gathering in the colony. Even if nobody stands in the yard and announces it plainly, Virginia still looks unfinished in many ways. Its laws are incomplete. Its settlements remain fragile. Its people argue, improvise, and patch together daily life with the elegance of a damp emergency. But beneath all that disorder, one thing is becoming clearer. The colony wants labour it can hold more tightly, for longer, and with fewer questions. That desire changes everything. Tobacco is the reason. Or rather, tobacco and the English reaction to it. A profitable crop does not simply fill ships and purses. It reshapes moral imagination. It teaches planters to see land as waiting to be claimed and workers as inputs to be secured. The more tobacco succeeds, the less patient the colony becomes with any uncertainty surrounding labour. Service that ends begins to look inconvenient. Promises become expensive. Human flexibility starts to offend economic ambition. Once profit settles into the bones of a colony, it rarely develops gentler manners. You hear this shift in everyday talk. Men discuss labour terms with an edge that feels sharper than before. They worry about shortages, about servants finishing contracts, about losing useful hands, about fields expanding faster than households can manage. The language may remain practical, but the pressure inside it grows. A person is praised for strength, endurance, obedience, skill, youth, and health in ways that sound less like appreciation and more like valuation. The body becomes a longer-term investment in other people's eyes. A central historical fact is that the fully developed legal regime of racial slavery in English Virginia had not yet been completed in 1625, but the colony was moving toward harsher and more permanent forms of black bondage over the following decades. Court rulings, legislative acts, and customary practices later made African descent more closely tied to lifelong servitude and hereditary status. The first years did not yet contain the whole structure, but they already contained its direction. That direction can be felt before it is fully written. A master becomes less willing to treat black labour as temporary. A household speaks of one person's future as though it belongs to the household rather than the person. A child born into a dependent family is looked at not only with affection or need, but with calculation. Questions of term, inheritance, and ownership begin to gather into something colder. You may not know every legal detail that will come, but you can feel the social temperature dropping. The English do not invent this drift from nothing. They are part of a wider Atlantic world already shaped by conquest, forced labour, and the buying and selling of African people. Virginia's story belongs to that larger system. Ships carry more than goods. They carry habits of power, commercial logic, and moral evasions tested elsewhere. The colony borrows from broader patterns while adapting them to local conditions. It is making something new, yes, but not from innocent materials. You notice, too, that religion offers less protection than lofty words might suggest. In theory, Christian teaching could complicate efforts to hold black people in perpetual bondage. In practice, economic desire proves wonderfully creative when faced with moral inconvenience. Colonists who speak earnestly of salvation often find ways to separate spiritual language from social equality. Baptism may cleanse the soul, they imply, while leaving labour arrangements conveniently untouched. Theological flexibility becomes strongest exactly where profits are threatened. This hardening shows itself in the treatment of difference. Blackness is becoming more than visible difference in the colony. It is becoming a category with legal and economic consequences. Not complete yet, not fully codified, but the direction is unmistakable. English poverty may still be pitied. English service may still be imagined as temporary. Black labour is increasingly pulled toward a harsher logic, one less interested in contracts and more interested in permanence. The body marked as African becomes easier for the colony to imagine as permanently claimable. That is one of the darkest transformations in early America. It does not begin with a single shout or a single document. It grows through repeated acts of convenience. One decision here, one case there, one habit accepted because it benefits a planter. One distinction drawn because it reassures authority. Over time, these choices accumulate into a structure so solid that later generations forget it was built. They talk as if it had always existed, but it was made by people, which is a much more chilling truth. The senses of the colony reflect this change in quiet ways. You can smell the same curing tobacco, wet earth, and smoke as always, but the atmosphere around labour feels different. Tasks are assigned with greater possessiveness. Voices linger over questions of ownership. Records matter more. Names become attached not just to households but to valuations of long-term control. The scratch of a pen across paper gains weight when the colony is learning to convert ambiguity into bondage. A quirky detail of early Virginia is how serious colonists became about paperwork, even while living in conditions that kept ruining paper. Moisture warped it, mildew attacked it, fire threatened it, and still they wrote inventories, lists, contracts, and accounts with determined intensity. There is something almost absurd about men in smoky wooden houses creating the bureaucratic foundations of oppression while trying to keep rats out of the grain. For black Americans, the emotional toll of this shift would be profound. Uncertainty is frightening. But a hardening system can be worse because it narrows the future itself. A person may once have hoped that service could end, that skill might lead to independence, that family ties or baptism could open a path, that local custom might remain flexible. As bondage becomes more racialized and more hereditary, those hopes come under direct attack. The colony is not merely demanding work, it is trying to define destiny. Children make this especially painful. Once a society begins tying status to descent, birth itself becomes political. A baby is no longer only a child welcomed, worried over, fed, soothed, and watched. The colony also sees future labour, future ownership, future inheritance of condition. That is a brutal way to imagine human life, and yet it becomes central to the emerging system. The cradle and the ledger move closer together. Historians continue to debate exactly when and how this hardening should be marked. Because law, custom, and daily practice did not all change at the same speed. Some scholars emphasize the gradual nature of the process. Others point to early evidence of severe coercion and racial distinction already present from the beginning. Both views capture something real. The movement toward racial slavery in Virginia was both incremental and deeply rooted. It emerged over time, but not accidentally. The English class system also plays a role here. Poor English servants could be exploited harshly, but they still belong to the larger social category of Englishness, with at least the theoretical possibility of term completion and social inclusion. As the colony develops, race helps reorganize hierarchy by giving even poor whites a distinction above black labourers. That distinction becomes politically useful. It eases cross-class tension among the English by redirecting status downward onto black people. A divided colony discovers the convenience of racism. You can hear the results in casual speech. Jokes turn sharper, assumptions grow bolder, categories are repeated more confidently. People begin to speak as though social difference is obvious, natural, and ancient, even when it's still being assembled in front of them. Repetition does powerful work. Once a distinction is spoken often enough, many start to mistake it for truth instead of policy. Violence supports this process, even when not spectacular. Discipline grows more racialized, mobility tightens, the threat of force becomes part of how permanence is taught. A person does not need to see extreme punishment every day to understand the message. It is enough to know that resistance can be answered physically, legally, and communally. Fear helps the new order settle into habit, and yet human beings do not yield inwardly as easily as systems would like. Even while the colony hardens, black life still contains memory, skill, family, humour, prayer, and observation. Those things matter because bondage seeks not only labour but submission. A person who continues to think, remember, and hope remains more than the role imposed upon them. Oppression finds that deeply inconvenient. At night, when fires dim and the settlement quiets, the larger shape of the colony can almost be sensed in the dark. You hear frogs near the marsh, a distant cough, wind moving lightly through the trees, the creak of timber settling after heat. Somewhere a child stirs. Somewhere a man turns over on a pallet, exhausted. Somewhere someone is thinking about what tomorrow will demand. The sounds are ordinary, but the society surrounding them is changing. It is becoming more deliberate in its cruelty. The tragedy is that much of this change presents itself as practicality. More secure labour, more stable households, better management, clearer status, order. Colonies love such words. They polish injustice until it looks like administration. They turn appetite into policy and call it necessity. Virginia is learning that language now, and black Americans are among the first to feel what it means when economic convenience begins dressing itself as social truth. So you live in a moment when the shape of bondage is still forming but already tightening. The field, the household, the church, the court, and the ledger are slowly aligning around a harsher idea. Black life is being pushed toward permanence in servitude, toward inherited condition, toward a future claimed by others before it can be lived. That future is not fully built in 1625, but its frame is rising. And in the humid air of Virginia, thick with tobacco scent and human ambition, you can sense the beams going up around you. When you look across Virginia in 1625, what stays with you is not one single image. It is a collection of textures, sounds, and human tensions that together form the beginning of a long American story. Wet ground underfoot, tobacco smoke hanging in the air, timber walls darkened by damp and use, the scrape of hoes in the fields, the murmur of prayer in an English room, the hush of evening settling over water and marsh. In that world, black life is already present, already essential, and already misunderstood by the colony that depends on it. The official record does not help much at first glance. It offers names that flicker in and out. It offers counts, lists, and sparse notes. It tells you that people were there, but rarely tells you how they felt, what they feared, what they loved, what they remembered, or what they hoped might still be possible. This is one of the great frustrations of early American history. The people who most deserve to be known fully are often the ones described most thinly by the written sources left behind, and yet the thinness of the archive should not fool anyone into thinking the lives themselves were thin. They were not. A black person in early Virginia lived in full human dimension, even when colonial records flattened that life into a line of ink. There was fatigue, hunger, skill, memory, dignity, anger, tenderness, humour, calculation, faith, private grief, brief relief, ordinary boredom, fleeting joy. All the things that make a life were present, even if the page refuses to admit it. That is one of the most important truths to carry from these first years in America. Black Americans did not enter history when the English chose to notice them. They arrived already possessing history. They came with names, places, kin networks, experiences, and cultural worlds behind them. Virginia tried to absorb them into its labour system and its records. It did not create their humanity. It merely tested it, exploited it, and tried to define it for its own convenience. A central historical fact is that the black presence in English America began early. Before the later plantation order had fully matured into the rigid system most people associate with racial slavery. In those first decades, status could be unstable, local, and inconsistent. Some individuals of African descent later gained freedom, property, or legal standing, while many others faced coercion that was already harsh and increasingly permanent. This uneven beginning matters because it reminds you that history does not usually begin in finished form. It begins in choices, habits, experiments, and power struggles that later harden into institutions. That hardening is perhaps the saddest lesson in the whole scene. The colony did not start as a clean blueprint for the later slave South. It became one through economic pressure, racial thinking, legal decisions, and the steady desire of powerful people to secure labour more completely. In 1625, you are standing close enough to the beginning to see the uncertainty still flicker. Some outcomes remain unwritten. Some lives still move through narrow openings. Some categories are still being argued into existence. But the appetite beneath the system is already visible, and appetites that profitable rarely choose restraint. You also come away understanding how fragile the English colony itself really was. Later myths prefer the image of purposeful settlement, brave endurance, and orderly growth. The reality is wetter, smokier, and much more nervous. Colonists fear disease, hunger, native resistance, labour shortage, debt, and each other's ambition. Their authority is real, but it is never effortless. It must be repeated and defended daily. That fragility matters because it helps explain why control became so important to them. People who feel insecure often become more desperate to dominate, For Black Americans, that colonial insecurity created a dangerous environment. On the one hand, instability sometimes left cracks where negotiation, skill, or family life could take root. On the other hand, instability also encouraged harsher control because labour was too valuable to lose and fear was too familiar to ignore. Virginia did not need to be confident to be cruel. In some ways, its uncertainty made cruelty more likely. You can also see, more clearly than many old textbooks allowed, that black life in 1625 was shaped by more than relations with the English alone. The colony existed within native Virginia, among indigenous peoples whose own political worlds, agricultural systems, and territorial knowledge predated English arrival by generations. That broader landscape mattered. It meant the English were not alone, not secure, and not masters of an empty continent. Black Americans entered a human world already crowded with power, contact, suspicion, and adaptation. That fact makes the early story richer and far less tidy. Historians still disagree on many details of these first years. They debate how fluid status truly was. They debate how often black and native communities interacted directly. They debate how much room for advancement existed before legal systems hardened further. They debate whether certain examples represent wider patterns or rare exceptions. These disagreements are not failures of history. They are signs that the past is complicated and that the surviving evidence is partial. What matters is not forcing full certainty, but holding firmly to what can be known, and much can be known. Black people were present in the earliest English colonies. They laboured in fields and households. They endured disease, scarcity, and social vulnerability. They brought knowledge and memory with them. They helped sustain a colony that would later deny how much it owed them. They lived through a formative period when race and bondage were tightening into a more permanent structure. Those are not minor footnotes. They are foundational realities. A quirky but revealing truth about the early colony is how much it depended on people it barely understood. The English could count tobacco leaves, list tools, and argue about property with exhausting confidence, yet remained strangely blind to the human depth of those working beside them. Colonial records often sound as though they were compiled by men who could inventory a goat more completely than a person. That habit has consequences. It teaches later generations to mistake incomplete records for incomplete lives. One reason this story matters so much is that it changes how you think about beginnings. Many people want beginnings to be simple. They want a neat origin point, a clean category, a first moment that explains everything that follows. But early black life in America does not offer that comfort. It offers ambiguity, adaptation, danger, and resilience all at once. It shows a people living inside a system still under construction, where the walls are not yet finished but the shape of confinement is already visible. That complexity should not be flattened into optimism. It is true that some Africans and their descendants in the 17th century found paths to freedom, landholding, or legal recognition that later generations would be denied more systematically. But those examples existed inside a deeply unequal world already moving toward racial slavery, not outside it. They reveal possibility, yes, but also how narrow possibility could be when surrounded by growing oppression. Hope and warning live side by side in this period. You also carry away a deeper respect for the ordinary act of survival. Historical writing often honours dramatic figures, famous laws and public events. Those matter. But in 1625, survival itself is one of the great achievements. To wake in a damp colony, eat little, work hard, endure uncertainty, hold on to memory, and continue living with some sense of self was no small feat. It required strength of body, but also strength of mind and spirit. The archives may not celebrate that endurance loudly. They should. There is another lesson here too. Early America was not merely built by ideas, it was built by bodies, by hands planting tobacco, by backs carrying loads, by women cooking, washing, mending, and keeping life moving through smoky rooms. by labourers repairing fences, tending animals, managing tools, preserving food, rowing boats, and nursing the sick. Black labour was part of that foundation from the start. To tell the story of America without that fact is to describe a house while pretending its beams appeared by magic. And what of memory? That may be the quietest and strongest thread of all. In a place where names could be altered and lives reduced on paper, memory kept doing its patient work. A true name spoken softly, a habit in the hand, a style of cooking, a prayer, a rhythm, a way of carrying sorrow without surrendering entirely to it. These things do not look large from a distance. Up close, they are immense. They are how people remain themselves when a system tries to redefine them. So what did the first years leave behind? They left a pattern, they left a warning, they left the earliest visible form of a nation learning how to profit from black labour while denying black personhood. They left examples of resilience that later generations would need again and again. They left records too sparse for comfort and lives too important to forget. They left the beginning of a struggle over freedom, belonging, memory, and power that would shape centuries. By the end of this long look at 1625, you understand that the phrase "first years in America" contains more than arrival. It contains improvisation, exploitation, adaptation, and the first tightening of chains not yet fully forged. It contains cold mornings, hungry afternoons, smoky evenings, and anxious nights. It contains people who could not know the full future, but who still had to live inside the opening chapter of it. Their world was not finished. Neither was the injustice forming around them, and still, they lived. That may be the simplest sentence and the most powerful. They lived in a colony that counted them incompletely. They lived through labour, sickness, uncertainty, and the slow hardening of bondage. They lived while preserving pieces of self that empire could not fully measure. They lived at the threshold of a history that would grow darker in many ways, but also more resistant, more creative, and more determined to testify. In the wet air of Virginia, among leaf smoke and river mist, the first black Americans in English America were already shaping the country long before the country was willing to admit it. Now the night settles more gently around the settlement. The noise of the day has thinned into softer sounds. A low fire sighs in the hearth. The river moves in darkness beyond the houses, patient and steady. Damp earth cools under the evening air. The scent of smoke lingers in wood, cloth, and hair. But it no longer feels harsh. It simply drifts. You let the harsher details loosen their grip. The sharp edges of records, commands, and fear grow quieter. What remains is the human presence within the scene. A few voices speaking low, a child finally asleep, hands at rest after long work, the slow comfort of stillness after strain. Overhead, the sky opens wide and calm, and the colony seems smaller now, almost hushed beneath it. You do not need to solve every question left by history tonight. It is enough to sit with the lives that were there, to honour their effort, to remember that even in uncertain beginnings, people carried memory, skill, and dignity into the dark. The river keeps moving, the reeds whisper softly. Somewhere beyond the last glow of firelight, the land breathes in its own ancient rhythm. So let the scene grow dimmer now. Let the smoke fade. Let the footsteps quiet. Let the names remain, even where the paper failed them. Rest with the knowledge that these lives mattered, fully and deeply, whether the colony understood them or not. And as the last sounds settle into the Virginia night, let your thoughts drift gently with them, out over the dark water, under the patient stars, and into sleep.